Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Welcome to this session organized by the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard University. My name is Jort de Jong. I'm the faculty director, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Julia Minson. She is a professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and she specializes in disagreement. Disagreement, of course, is integral to a lot of the work of public problem solving in cities. It happens in organizations, across organizations, within encounters with residents, in intergovernmental relationships, and so forth. But disagreement does not have to be a negative thing per se. The real challenge is to overcome disagreement and to strengthen relationships and building better ideas. Now, there's no better expert to speak about this topic than Professor Julia Minson. She is the author of the book Disagreeing Better, How to Disagree Better, which is available for pre-order right now and comes out in 2 weeks. And I highly encourage you to take a look at that book because it's full of tons of research-based insights that are also very practical in nature. And to get a sense of what the book is about and the expertise that Professor Minson brings to this topic, there is an interactive session for you today where you get to learn from these insights, but also engage with one another in small breakout groups. So we're very glad that you're joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the session. And please join me in welcoming Professor Julia Minson.
Thanks, Jorrit. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So as Jorrit mentioned, I am a behavioral scientist, and I have spent my entire career trying to understand how people can have thoughtful, engaged, constructive conversations across some of our bitterest divisions. Now, of course, the world has given me no shortage of opportunities to study what I study. People disagree all the time. We disagree with our friends. We disagree with our families. We, of course, disagree in the workplace. And probably the most salient disagreements of all these days are the disagreements in the political sphere. Now, part of the reason I find disagreement so incredibly fascinating as a researcher is that, as Jorrit mentioned, understanding how to engage with opposing perspectives while at the same time making a clear, robust argument for your own beliefs is an incredibly vital leadership practice, right? In every organization, whether you're running a city, whether you're running a nation, or whether you're running a corporation, being able to disagree effectively improves our decision making. It helps us predict the future more accurately, and it prevents us from making truly, truly catastrophic errors. And of course, that's not just the case at work. That is also the case in our families. That is also the case in our communities. Yet, despite the many benefits of disagreement, people are not really good at it, right? Most of the time, we try to avoid disagreement. We try to kind of sweep it under the rug, not bring up those topics that can be sort of so dangerous. And you might say, well, Julia, if disagreement is so good for us, if disagreement is so good for organizations and for leadership and for decision making, why aren't we engaging with it more actively? And I would say, well, Exhibit A is the last 5 years, right? So if you think about going back to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, people severed close friendships and even family relationships around the question of whether masking was appropriate and necessary, and around the questions around the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. Then came the murder of George Floyd, and we had bitter national disagreement about concepts like defunding the police. Then Roe v. Wade got repealed, and we couldn't have a conversation about that one either. Then we had bitter division about the very nature of gender, the U.S. role in the war in Ukraine, and then, of course, Gaza. Now, many of these conflicts fall along sort of familiar liberal conservative lines, right? But many are brand new, like COVID, and some have flipped traditional allegiances, like Gaza. But what they all have in common is that some topics are so emotional, so consequential, so morally charged that people simply cannot approach these conversations without feeling like they're going to come out battered and bruised. And so understandably, they avoid them. So our challenge with disagreement, right, isn't simply that we need to reconcile liberals with conservatives, or that we need to reconcile the supporters of Israel with supporters of Gaza, but that we need a robust toolkit to disagree constructively about whatever the next thing is that we can't disagree about. Right? We don't know what the next problem is that's going to come down the pike that makes it incredibly difficult for us as a country and as leaders of organizations to have constructive conversations. We just know that there is going to be a problem. And so that's what a lot of my work is around. How do we have conversations that allow us to debate the most important topics with grace, authenticity, and care? Now, of course, I'm an academic, so when I see a problem in the world, what do? I write a book. My book is called How to Disagree Better. It's coming out on March 24th, and it has received a lot of positive feedback from both practitioners and academics across the political spectrum, because what I really try to do in this book is offer a first of its kind evidence-based toolkit for everyday people to be able to disagree constructively across a wide variety of situations. The QR code here allows you to learn more about the book. It also allows you to download the first chapter so you can get a sense of sort of how I make my argument and the type of insights that you're going to find. But what I want to do today is sort of share 3 ideas from the book, and then try to get into a conversation as much as, this online format allows us to do that about some of those ideas, and maybe even have a little bit of a debate. Okay, so here are 3 key ideas. The first idea that really motivates this work is the idea of receptiveness to opposing views. When I first began my career, I was a PhD student at Stanford, and what I noticed looking around is that, look, some people are much better at engagement with opposing perspectives than others, right? Some people seem to be able to thoughtfully consider information they disagree with, kind of really noodle on it, evaluate it in a fair-minded manner, and they seem to have different dynamics around disagreement. So what we did over several years worth of work is really define this construct so that we were clear on what this thing is. Ultimately, we came to define receptiveness as a person's willingness to access, consider, and evaluate supporting and opposing views in a relatively impartial manner. Now, what I want you to notice is that this definition really focuses on information processing, right? There is nothing in here about compromise or agreement or finding common ground. The idea behind receptiveness is that people who are more receptive are better at thinking hard about ideas on both their own side and the opposing side of a particular argument or debate, right? They're not looking for compromise. They're not looking to give up their beliefs. They are simply thinking harder. We spent about 5 years trying to understand this trait and trying to figure out how to measure it. At one point, we ended up publishing a peer-reviewed paper that contained a scale that you can use to measure your own receptiveness. Then, of course, we realized that, well, most people don't read peer-reviewed academic papers, so we put the scale on a website. I will show you the website momentarily, but I want you to think about why this matters. Receptiveness has a variety of benefits, and these benefits fall into sort of 2 buckets. People who are more receptive do 2 things differently. They are better decision makers, and they garner some interpersonal benefits. So on the decision-making side, people who are more receptive are better at consuming information from both sides, right? When they see a question and there are two sides to the issue, even if they strongly believe in one side themselves, they are better at reading and listening to folks on the other side. They're also better at paying attention to what they're reading or listening to. So do a little thought experiment. Imagine you're in the dentist's office and you are listening to the news because you're in the waiting room and you're waiting for the dentist, right? And the news is playing something you disagree with, right? So maybe if you're a conservative person, the news is playing a liberal news station. If you're a liberal person, the news is playing a conservative news station. Even though you're trapped in that situation because you're sitting in the waiting room, it is very easy to just tune out, right? You're like there in the presence of the information, but you're not really listening. What people who are more receptive do is they're better at maintaining attention even when they disagree with the information they're receiving. And then when they have to think about that information, when they have to consider whether they want to retain it, whether they want to make decisions based on it, whether they think it's accurate or true or fair, they are less biased in how they evaluate that information. They don't just sort of like dismiss it out of hand because they don't agree with it. They noodle on it. But those are just the decision-making benefits. More receptive people also garner some important interpersonal benefits. So we know that people who are more receptive form more cross-partisan friendships. Most of us have friends that belong to our same ideology, right? Liberals are friends with liberals, conservatives are friends with conservatives. That means that all of us are missing out on half of the people in the world who could be important sources of social support, information, right? Insights. People who are more receptive are better at that stuff. They cross the line more often. Other people get that receptiveness is a good thing. So they are more willing to collaborate and seek advice from people who are more receptive. And finally, when they do encounter disagreement, people who are more receptive experience less emotional negativity, right? So they are just like cooler when they disagree. They experience less drama. So this is definitely a skill, a mindset, a habit that is worth cultivating. And so a good place to start is you can measure your own level of receptiveness. The way you can do that is you can go to this website. As I said, when we realized that folks don't read academic journals very much, we put the survey on a publicly open website, disagreeingbetter.com/survey. And you can measure your own receptiveness. You can get your individualized scores with explanations. And if you want to have like a truly wild time, you can do this on the weekend with your family and decide who in your family is the most receptive person. Don't do it right now because I'm trying to teach you some more things, but this is a good thing to do after the webinar ends. So one thing that we were very excited about was that we understood that there was this thing called receptiveness, right? And that people differed on how receptive they were. And that these differences had important benefits. But at some point, we started thinking about this other idea, which is that disagreement is by definition an interpersonal process. Right? In other words, anytime for a disagreement to unfold, you need to have at least two people. You need to have multiple opinions. You need to have multiple perspectives. It's very, very hard to disagree with yourself. And so the question that brings up is, if receptiveness is important, how can we show our receptiveness to our counterpart? Right? Because if I'm sort of like receptive in my brain and nobody knows about it, then it might not have as many benefits as we hope for. And so this is a question that I would like to pose to you. And this is sort of the interactive part of all of this that Jorrit highlighted in his introduction. We are going to spend a little bit of time brainstorming together to understand how people can show their receptiveness so that their counterpart can actually experience it and they have that more positive interaction that we're hoping for. So we're going to put you all into breakout rooms of 2 people. And you're going to meet a complete stranger, which is phenomenal and wonderful, and you should be excited about it. And then after you introduce yourself to that complete stranger, I would like the 2 of you to do a little brainstorming exercise. The exercise is to come up with 3 strategies that you think would be effective for demonstrating receptiveness in a disagreement. Okay? What are 3 things that you can do to help the other person feel like you are really engaging with their perspective, like you're doing all this mental work to listen to them and understand their point of view? But also, we don't want to be naive about this, right? Because if all of these strategies worked easily, then everybody would be doing them. What I also want you to think about is what makes it difficult for people to enact these strategies, right? What might be getting in the way for us doing these things that might seem like good ideas in concept? Okay, so we're going to go into breakout rooms. We're going to take a few minutes to do this exercise. And when you come back, I'm going to ask you to put your ideas into the webinar chat so that we can go over all of them together and see what we get and see what kind of insights and wisdom we can glean from all of this. All right, friends, we are back. Thank you for your hard work that you did in your breakout rooms. I hope you had a nice, interesting, engaging conversation with your brand new friend. What I would like now is to hear what you came up with. So you all have a Q&A button on your Zoom window, and I would love for you to take those ideas, those 3 strategies that you came up with, and some of the difficulties that you identified, and put them into the Q&A. And then we're going to take a look together and see what we have come up with as a group. Okay, let's see some ideas. I see folks typing away. Let's get them in there. Okay, so here are some ideas I'm seeing. Repeat back what they're saying to make sure everyone is on the same page. Active listening. Oh, active listening is a really popular one. I'm seeing a lot of references to active listening. Observe body language. Asking questions with curiosity. Visual cues like attentiveness facing the partner, talking back method, right? Engaging body language. So far the winners are question asking, body language, and active listening. Let's see. Let's scroll a little bit and see what else is down there. Got many, many ideas. Okay, we got deep listening, more asking questions, step back to seek and understand, eye contact. Okay, now you guys are not giving me a lot of challenges. So far, it seems like we've solved the problem. I see one challenge. Virtual is harder to gauge body language and communicate well. That's absolutely true, right? So in virtual communication, communicating receptiveness is absolutely more difficult. The real gap, sort of according to the research, seems to be between spoken communication and written communication. So if you can ever pick up the phone or get on Zoom, people tend to make better connection when they hear each other's voice than if you're doing this by text or by email. Okay, let's see what else do we have. Try to find common ground, common values, repeat back what you've understood. Confirmation feedback. More active listening, more open body language, repeating what was said to acknowledge understanding, being open and receptive. The struggle is letting go of preconceived notions. Okay, so I think this is a really, really terrific list. And now you all have this sort of like common body of ideas, some of which, you see which ones are the most popular, some of which may spark some new thinking for you all. One of the ways that I think about how we communicate receptiveness is sort of as a pipeline of information flow, right? I am trying to be receptive because I decided that this is a good thing to be, right? Maybe I read the book, maybe I read the research, and I want my counterpart to know that I am really trying to engage with their perspective. But it turns out that information sort of leaks out when we engage in social interactions. So I call this the leaky pipeline of social interaction. And this is a really good metaphor. Let me explain to you what I mean. So imagine we're having this conversation, okay? This person is you. You are trying to be receptive and open-minded to your counterpart. And then you have your counterpart. And of course, remember, the name of the game is that they need to recognize that you're being receptive and open-minded, because otherwise, how would they know that you're really trying to engage with their views? Here is something that might happen. You might go into this conversation and say to yourself, I am going to try really hard to have empathy for their perspective. I am going to try to engage with intellectual humility. I am going to be open-minded. And then you show up in the conversation and the other person starts talking, and what you find yourself is achieving only part of what you intended, right? You intended to be really open-minded, but you are kind of open-minded. Why might that be the case? Well, because emotional regulation is difficult, right? When other people start telling you things you disagree with, it's very natural for your emotions to go up, right? To start sort of feeling your heartbeat accelerating, your breath accelerating. You might get hot in the face. You might feel frustrated or angry or confused. And so the intentions you had don't fully match what happens in the moment. But remember, you are still doing a little bit of what you intended to do, right? You're still trying to be empathetic. You're still trying to be curious. And so then the next thing you need to do is you need to communicate what you are experiencing in your mind to your counterpart. Now, how we communicate things is through visible behavior, right? And that visible behavior often turns into a mixed bag, because unless you are a trained actor, you're very likely to use some incorrect signals, and you're very likely to deliver your signals inconsistently, right? So you might be thinking really, really hard about what your counterpart is saying, but you might be making a weird face, or you might be crossing your arms, or you might be leaning back. There's all kinds of things that could be happening behaviorally that are not exactly what you intended. And so then, of course, your counterpart has to read all of that. And when they're reading it, chances are what they get is a completely garbled signal relative to what you intended. Why does that happen? Well, because they are also a person in disagreement. And so they are expecting all kinds of negativity from this experience. And they process your behavior through the lens of that negativity, okay? And so you started out with really good intentions, but your counterpart isn't giving you credit for any of it because that's not what they are experiencing. So this model has some really important implications for how we should behave. If intervening on people's intentions makes little difference, we should be doing something else, right? We shouldn't be telling folks to be more empathetic or exercise great intellectual humility, because it's really, really hard to enact those good intentions. What we should be doing instead is intervening on behavior, right? Visible behavior is the thing that your counterpart is actually reacting to. So let's fix that so that it's easy for them to see what you're trying to accomplish. And if we're going to intervene on visible behavior, then we need to identify the correct behaviors. What are the behaviors in a conversation that are the most transparent, the most easily interpretable, and that have the most common meaning, okay? And that turns out is language, okay? So what I'm going to argue for my second of my 3 points is that when you are in a disagreement, what really matters is behavior, not thoughts and feelings. In fact, your behavior matters more than your mental habit of receptiveness, because receptiveness only matters to the extent that people can actually perceive it in conversation. And the type of behavior that matters the most is linguistic behavior. In other words, the words and phrases that you say that other people can readily understand and perceive. How did we reach this conclusion? So we spent years studying how people who are receptive or less receptive navigate conflict. And what we found was that there wasn't actually a tremendous amount of correlation between how receptive people felt they were being and how receptive their counterparts saw them as being. What we saw instead is that certain words and phrases were perceived as signals of receptiveness. And so we started studying these words and phrases. We used machine learning to analyze thousands and thousands of conversational transcripts to understand what it is that people can say in conversation that can make their counterpart feel like, oh, you're really listening to me. You're really taking me seriously. You're trying to understand. And so we now refer to those words and phrases as conversational receptiveness. So specific words and phrases that make people feel heard during active disagreement. Now, what we have learned over the years of research is that using high levels of conversational receptiveness in speech strongly predicts conflict outcomes. In other words, if your language is peppered with these words and phrases, people see you as more objective, as more trustworthy. They think you give better advice, and they want to talk to you again, right? So my definition of what it means to have a constructive disagreement is that at the end of it, I want to talk to you and you want to talk to me. And that's what conversational receptiveness does. The great news about it is that it's super easy to train and it's super easy to learn, because we're not talking about years of therapy. We are talking about memorizing some very concrete words. And finally, and perhaps the most exciting part of this work for me, is that conversational receptiveness is effortlessly reciprocated. So when I am receptive to you, even if you may have come into this conversation looking for a fight, it makes you receptive to me, right? People mimic all sorts of behavior. People mimic laughter, body language, emotional expression, and receptiveness is one of the many things that we mimic. So this tendency for receptiveness to be reciprocated gives us a tremendous amount of power and agency over our conversations, because if I want somebody to be receptive to me, I need to simply model what I'm hoping to achieve. Okay, so at this point, a reasonable thing to ask is, Julia, what are the magic words and phrases? And so I'm going to tell you. When we did the natural language processing work, we wrote an algorithm, right? And an algorithm just sort of spits out a list that doesn't have any particular rhyme or reason to it. But of course, as psychologists, we were able to sort of find themes in the list and categorize them into what we call features of receptiveness. And the most important features make up a nice, easy to remember acronym, okay? The acronym is HEAR, as in I hear you. The H in HEAR stands for hedging your claims. So it's phrases like, I think it's possible that, or this might happen because, or some people tend to think. So for example, I could say the COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective. Okay, that's a strong statement. Or I could say most physicians tend to believe that the COVID-19 vaccine is largely safe and effective. I just crammed 3 hedges into one sentence, but I've said the same thing, right? I have sort of signaled my support of vaccination, but I left a little room for my counterpart's perspective. The E stands for emphasizing agreement. So it's phrases like, I think we both want to, I agree with some of what you're saying, or we are both concerned with. Remember, I told you in the beginning, receptiveness is not about compromise or changing your mind. But any two humans can find something that they agree on, some value that they share, and emphasizing that agreement before you dive into dissecting the disagreement can really sort of put you on the same side of the table, right? So I think we both want to work in an organization where all employees feel safe and respected. That's pretty hard to disagree with. The A stands for acknowledging the other perspectives. So A means taking just a few seconds to show with your words that you were listening when your counterpart was talking, right? So you are restating their perspective using phrases like, I understand that, or I see your point, or what I think you're saying is. The idea behind acknowledgement is that you don't want to just claim that you heard the person. You can't say, I hear you, but we don't have the budget right now. You have to show that you heard them. So you could say something like, I hear that you're very concerned about how hard the team has been working, and you're worried about delivering this project on time. However, we don't have the budget for additional staff right now. The outcome is still the same. We still don't have the budget. But I demonstrated with my words that I was actually listening when you were talking. And finally, the R stands for reframing to the positive. And the R does sort of double duty for us. It includes dropping some of the negative and contradictory words like can't, no, won't, don't, hate, terrible, and replacing them with some more positively valenced words like I think it's great when, or I really appreciate it when, or it would be so wonderful if. So if you wanted to say, I hate it when people push me to make stressful decisions, please stop, I could say instead, I really appreciate it when people give me more time to make important decisions, right? So what I did is I said, I want more time, but I did it in a way that is more positively valenced so that the conversation sort of doesn't spiral. Okay, so the HERE framework allows you to say exactly what you came to say, but in a way that acknowledges that there is another perspective and shows your counterparts with visible, interpretable behavior, language, right, that you are truly engaged with their point of view. Which brings me to my third and final point. Constructive disagreement is a skill. It is not sort of a magical ability, right? It is a skill like playing the piano or riding a bike or doing data analysis. We can get better at it through consistent evidence-based practice. And this perhaps is the most important point I can make today, but it only matters if you really put the work in. I think of disagreement skills as living at sort of 3 different levels of analysis. So as an individual human, you can cultivate your own level of receptiveness, right? You can take the online survey, you can think about the barriers that you experience when you try to become more receptive, and you can start working on that process. On your team or in conversations at home or when you speak with your neighbors, you can practice receptive communication. So the HERE framework is not going to solve sort of all of world conflict, but it is an incredible scaffolding to have conversations that are just a little bit more constructive and have a little bit less heat behind them. And finally, we should be all working as leaders of organizations to make our teams and organizations more receptive, right? To build organizational capacity so this becomes the norm of how we interact. And so in my book, I spend quite a lot of time providing sort of tools and ideas and unpacking the research behind all these ideas. Here is the QR code again for downloading the first chapter. And now I think we have a few minutes to take some questions in the Q&A and have a bit of a conversation around this. As we are pulling up the new questions, I want to pick up one of the difficulties that somebody brought up during the exercise, which is compromising your own values. And I think, a difficulty of receptiveness that people often bring up is, does being receptive mean compromising your own values? I think that's a really important question. It comes up all the time. And what I want to always highlight to folks is thinking about, well, why am I in this conversation, right? Often the conversations we're in with people who disagree are conversations that involve people we need in our lives, right? Their family members, their friends, their colleagues. And so we need to find a way to move forward. Receptiveness does not mean that you're going to agree with them, and it does not mean that you're going to endorse their position. But it does mean that you're going to listen long enough and with enough attention and enough engagement that you truly understand where they're coming from. So I don't think of that as compromise, right? I think of that as being better informed about the set of opinions and beliefs that are out there. And there's quite a lot of research that shows that when we do that, we're often surprised by what we find on the other side. Okay, let's see. We have some questions. Now I wonder, how can we apply this to people with narcissistic disorder? They're very difficult to talk and explain to. Okay. So this also often comes up. And, this question has an assumption that is sort of like deeply embedded in it, which is that a person who strongly disagrees with me is suffering from a mental health disorder, right? I am so convinced that I'm right and they're wrong that the way I can characterize this interaction is that this person is beyond reasoning with, right? And I think that's a big assumption. There are a lot of questions and sort of counter-arguments in this space that have to do with this person can't be reasoned with, this person is being irrational, I can't talk to them. It's back to the question of why are we talking to them? It may be that you have tried and this conversation is sort of too difficult, too personal. You've had this conversation too many times and you just need to walk away, right? Some relationships are just absolutely toxic and don't need to be tolerated. But many times when you go in with the intention to learn about the other perspective and the intention to really understand where they're coming from instead of telling them how things are and convincing them that they're that you're right and they're wrong, it really shifts the dynamic. So if it's a relationship that matters, that needs to be preserved, I encourage you to sort of approach it with this other mindset of, can I spend 15 minutes just trying to understand this person? Let's see. In the context of working in government, I'm often encountering residents who are extremely agitated. Can these listening techniques be used to diffuse someone and share the information they need? Yes, absolutely, 100%. So one way of thinking about this is that the reason we talk, the reason we utter words, is because we want to be listened to. And so often when a person is agitated and they are maybe raising their voice and they are maybe saying the same thing over and over again, It's because they don't feel like they've been heard, right? They need to say the thing again, and they need to say it louder so that they feel like they have made their message clear. And so this toolkit for showing them that you've heard them in a way that they can recognize can be incredibly valuable when working with folks who are very upset. Now, I will tell you that there is a cost, and the cost is that it takes more time, right? If you are showing your desire to learn and you want to engage with the other person and you want to truly understand them, then you have to take the time to listen to them once they start talking. And if they say things that, sound like nonsense and you disagree with and you've heard a million times before, you still have to keep listening because you're trying to convince them that you're really trying to, engage with their point of view. So where this is very, very difficult to do is if you are in a very time-pressured situation. But even then, it may be more effective than trying to barrel through the disagreement, because sometimes that approach blows up, into a bigger problem that then takes a lot more time to resolve. Let's see. I believe sometimes preconceived ideas sometimes hamper the healthy conversation. Yes, I absolutely agree. How do we make sure that we should get out of our own personal ideas? So that's a profound question and sort of quite a difficult one, because most people see the world the way they see the world, right? It's very hard to constantly be questioning your beliefs and assumptions. But what I like to remind folks of is that in any disagreement, there is a 50% chance that you're wrong, right? That chance may be higher than 50% if both people happen to be wrong, right? So one thing we need to be really, really mindful of is that strictly mathematically, we are wrong a lot of the time when we disagree with people. That has to be the case. And part of the challenge is that we try to avoid disagreement, right? We're uncomfortable with it. And we have surrounded ourselves with people that happen to agree with us, right? So most of us live in cities and towns where the overwhelming majority of other residents agrees with us politically. Yes, there are those outliers, but we are now more ideologically segregated in the United States than we have ever been in the past. And so it's difficult to sort of step out of your own beliefs because everybody around you believes the same thing. So this is where we have to really kind of make a thoughtful effort to find some people that we disagree with and intentionally and thoughtfully practice the art of trying to get into their heads, trying to understand where they're coming from. What are their values? What are their beliefs? What experiences have they had that lead them to hold those values and beliefs? And so again, in the book, I offer a bunch of sort of very small exercises that people can try that fit kind of different lifestyles, different levels of busyness, different levels of extroversion. But I think there's nothing better for getting out of your own assumptions than talking to other humans who disagree with you. Okay, let's see. What do we have now? Are there situations where we should not try to model receptivity? I'm thinking specifically about the moral harms of tolerance, of intolerance, if someone is espousing racism. Okay, that's a really, really important question. So from a leadership perspective, right, the way you behave dramatically impacts how others around you behave. And so one thing to consider is, what am I modeling, and how many ways is what I'm modeling being multiplied, right? The one way of thinking about it is that if I'm talking to one person, they reciprocate my behavior. But if I'm leading a team meeting and there's 10 people in my team and I'm doing this every single week, then my behavior becomes the model for those people that then gets propagated through sort of a broader ecosystem. And so the question becomes, what if somebody in that meeting says something highly objectionable, right? So we have studied kind of that scenario. And there's a couple things that are interesting about it. So one of the things that I think is very interesting and very important to remember is that quite often conflict comes from misunderstanding. So a person says something that seems inappropriate or offensive or hurtful or inaccurate, and that's just not what they meant. Right? They're also human who is also sort of not very good with their words sometimes, and they can say something that's not reflective of either their intentions or their core values. And so in that sense, receptiveness becomes an opportunity to explore of like, what did you really mean? Right? Quite often, again, when we interact with people, we then discover that their intentions and their beliefs and their values are much more closely aligned with ours than we believed they were in the beginning. Now, if we take the extreme example, somebody did truly sort of say something, racist, sexist, homophobic, blatantly false. The question then becomes, why are we having this interaction with this person, right? And what are the ways to sort of decrease the impact of that negativity, right? There are some cases where we have to deal with people who absolutely don't share our values. And so then we need to think about sort of the setting and how do we deal with them with the minimum fallout for other potentially vulnerable bystanders. And there are settings where we say, no, this is not okay. I don't agree with you. I don't condone this set of values and I don't condone this language. And that's sort of the end of that conversation, right? So receptiveness is not infinite, but it benefits us and stretches us in a lot more context than I think people often allow for. Okay, let's see. We're almost out of time. All right, folks. So we're going to have this list of questions. And what I want to leave you with here is my email here. So if you have a burning question, please just email me directly. I hope you all take a look at the book, read the first chapter. And I thank you all so much for your time being here.